Welcome back to Moby Dick. We are just about to start chapter 14, but before we do, it's a good time to summarize where we've been. So we're going to take this broadcast as an opportunity to review the beginning of the novel, from extracts through chapter 13. I want to first go through it with a kind of simple Hegelian binary thesis, antithesis discussion to point out the primary themes. But it's important in the reading of this novel to consider the synthesis of the units, not just the black and white, so to speak. Moby Dick is about what is in between. Moby Dick is about the gray, and we'll come back to that. So in the beginning, in extracts, we are presented with a compilation of references to whales throughout history. Whales as mentioned or described in theology, poetry, folklore, geography, political discourse, philosophy. Some of these quotes are misunderstood or misrepresented, either in their context or in their relevance to the idea of a whale and what it means in society. Now, we've been assuming that this is a mistake of understanding on the narrator's part, but it might not be. We have reason to believe that Ishmael, the narrator, is a schoolmaster himself, so he should have known the correct meanings of these texts, whether it's Hobbes' Leviathan or the Greek myths and gods and goddesses. What if he is deliberately misquoting or misrepresenting these texts, for example, specifically Hobbes' Leviathan, to illustrate the point of the pervasiveness of the idea of the whale in human consciousness and what it signifies? We don't have an answer for that yet, but it's a question to keep in mind. What if we are deliberately misdirected? What if Ishmael does know that he is making mistakes, and he's making these mistakes very carefully? Perhaps to unsettle us as readers, perhaps to slip things past us. Ishmael, as a narrator, is telling us a story. If this gets hard to read, try reading it out loud and imagine that you're sitting in a tavern with him over grog or stout, and he's telling you this story. It's the same piece of advice I was given when I tried to read Trainspotting. It makes more sense if you consider this as a part of the oral tradition of storytelling, and especially of sea yarns. After extracts, Ishmael introduces himself to us. So he presents the notion of the whale and its relationship to society first, and then he introduces himself. And we meet Ishmael and Kikig, and we get an early description of the world that they live in as seen by Ishmael from chapters 1 through chapters 13. At the end of chapter 13, they're on their little packet from New Bedford to Nantucket. So they have left traditional civilization, landed civilization, Christian society, and they're moving out. Back to our thesis, antithesis themes. Ishmael introduces us to what he wants to discuss. He wants to talk about the wild nature versus civilized land, which is a traditional romantic notion. Moby Dick is occasionally described as the epitome of American romantic literature. We also have the traditional binary of the Christian versus the savage, or the civilized versus the savage, and sanity versus madness. Again, these are all traditional romantic themes. Romanticism tends to place more value or more truth, I use this word loosely, more truth in the wild, in the untamed, in the unstructured, and all of this is being presented to us as part of the sea. We'll find out if that's true or not. I don't know. I'm not convinced that Melville is going to tote the party line here and give us a nice romantic story. I suspect it's more troublesome than that, but we'll find out. When I was reviewing my thoughts for this particular broadcast, at least up until now in Moby Dick, it reminds me a lot of The Heart of Darkness. Unfortunately, Heart of Darkness wasn't published at this time. It was published 50 years later. But there's an interesting relationship in Heart of Darkness also between going deeper into the land. It's the exact opposite, actually, of Moby Dick. You're going farther into the continent and away from the coastland. The coastland is civilized, and then you get into the jungle, and things go completely crazy. Anyway, if you read Heart of Darkness, you might find that an interesting comparison to make as you read Moby Dick. If you haven't, don't worry about it. I'm sure that this blog will cover it someday. Back to Moby Dick, though. Melville is very careful in his treatment of these themes. Even starting in the Spouter Inn and the Chapel, Ishmael is questioning how to understand what's civilized and what's wild, and what is Christian and what is savage. We see this in his thoughts about the sermon, about Jonah and the whale, but we also see this in his developing friendship with Kikig and his worship of Kikig's little black wooden idol. The definitions of these themes are becoming very fluid, if you'll excuse the term, and they're not as clear. It's not as obvious which one is civilized and which one isn't. So we see this a lot. You know, we see Kikig as the noble savage, but he's the one who performs the Christian act of heroics and saves the man who was teasing him on the boat. We see Ishmael twisting the notion of treating another person as he himself wants to be treated, and using that to justify worshiping an idol in an act of so-called Christian kindness. But you can see that they're playing with the assumptions that we have on what these words mean. Also, there's a lot of humor. I mean, again, I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, if this gets hard to read, try reading it out loud and imagine that somebody is just telling you a story. Also, remember, a lot of it is funny. It's okay to laugh. It's okay to not take this so seriously. I do want to make one point in particular. I've mentioned it before, but I do want to make this point because I think it's very important. There is currently in popular culture or in literary culture an aversion to reading traditional texts, and there's a real avoidance of the canon. I think that nowadays a lot of people don't even know what's in the canon. For example, you can go to UCLA and be an English major and not have to read Shakespeare or Milton anymore, and I find that obscene. How do you pretend to be literate if you don't understand what some of the greatest storytellers in this language have done before us? Literature of the minority is celebrated now, and a lot of great stuff has come from these so-called minority groups. These are important stories and they need to be read, but a minority, and I'm using this word in absence of something better, literature of the disenfranchised only makes sense if you understand the context from which it is speaking. It doesn't make any sense to talk about Richard Wright's native son if you don't understand the white South, if you don't understand Jim Crow South. The existence of a novel like Native Son makes absolutely no sense at all, and its power is greatly diminished by that ignorance. The avoidance of reading these canonical texts, I think, makes all of us dumber. I think we chase fads, and I think that we chase what is politically correct, and we therefore miss out on the essential humanity that is brought out in each and every one of these major texts. If something is big enough to stay in the canon, it's because it reveals something universal about the humanity in each one of us. And that is really the quest of literature and of art. We need to see what we have in common so that we can understand what our differences are. Far from being neutered or white or dead or male, without exception, any text that it can be found in a Norton anthology was, at the time of its publication, considered to be subversive and dangerous. Shrugging that off is narcissistic and naive and very arrogant. Literature is dangerous, and literature with lasting power is dangerous. To assume that it is a sleeping beast is illiterate. So I would really caution people away from dismissing reading the so-called great books. They truly are great, and they're great for a reason. As Melville brought out in Chapter 1, the universal thump is passed round, and all hands should rub one another's shoulder blades and be content. I don't think that Ishmael is telling us to just be happy with whatever our lot in life is, but I think he's cautioning us to be sympathetic to each other, because everyone is a minority in their mind, and that is part of what makes literature great. We see both what makes us different, but more importantly, all of the many more things which make us the same. I suspect as we get on our whaling ship and we head out to find the whale, we're going to find a great deal more about ourselves that is common and terrifying and insane, and ultimately very human.